Good morning, everybody. We're going to wait a few minutes just so people can come in and figure out. This is kind of all new to everybody. New technology, new new way of communicating, and for me, a new way of telling stories. I had originally intended to start a podcast, um, and uh, it occurred to me that as soon as I as soon as I was staring at a microphone, I couldn't talk. Typically, Kate and I, my wife, if you don't know her, are out all summer long and really all year long, going to conventions and gatherings and to churches and basically anywhere anybody will listen to me. And Kate, who is also a very gifted speaker. Um, and we haven't been anywhere for months now. Typically, I would have been down in New Orleans today at Hex Fest. Um, and there are a number of places that we go, typically to Canada and all throughout the US. And this is basically what I do, except I don't do it in my bed. I do it at conventions, at gatherings, and we really love talking to kids. And so, and Uh, I think of everybody as kids, actually, and I feel that old. But part of what I don't know what my religion is storytelling, and so this is my way of feeding my own obsession and need to tell stories. By profession, I guess, and by profession I mean by what I profess to be. Uh, I'm a Conchante of Guinea Yoruba Vodou, which means I'm a voodoo doctor. But as scary as that sounds, basically I tell stories, and so that is a really, really ancient um, profession. And so this is basically what I want to do. And these second Sundays are going to be that kind of a thing. Um, and so we won't pass the hat. I won't proselytize. I won't try to convince you to join any cults or anything. Hopefully, you're already in my cult. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ted Jiao. I am called Baba Teddy, both in the steampunk world and in the pagan world. And I am a African traditional priest, but I also have been apprenticed in Native American, Central American, North American traditions, as well as other world traditions. I'm going to, and I say that because today I'm going to talk about Christians. And so, very often people would imagine that that pagans and Christians don't get along, but I find myself in Christian churches all the time, and typically you can see me at Universalist, Unitarians, Unity, and but I also have been in Protestant and Catholic churches, and am fascinated by the history of all religions, and so how we all fit together. And so that's kind of where my story is today. But before we get into the story, I want to give people a few more minutes to come into here. I want to make sure, first of all, that everybody can hear me. So if somebody will just type there and say that they can hear me. This is a crowd cast, and I find that they really, really look good, sound good, and so if you're thinking about doing this kind of stuff and are sick of Zoom, this is a really good alternative. So that's my commercial that I'll start out with. So let's get into thanks, Turk. Let's get into how this story came about. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story today that nobody tells. It's not written anywhere. It's not put together. I actually came upon it by accident, and um, I am, if you don't know, I'm autistic. And that means that I'm the kind of person that doesn't know when to stop shutting up or when to stop talking or when I have no, I have no discernment. And that makes me a writer. And so a writer is just basically my form of obsessive compulsive behavior. And so sometimes when I like start to study something, I end up just going down rabbit holes. I know we all do this. It's like you click on one thing and then you find another thing and another thing and another thing and another thing. And so I was looking up the idea of grace. And so I grew up Pentecostal and Christian Reformed, Dutch Reformed. I'm Dutch, if you can't tell by looking at me. Um, and the idea that I grew up with of grace was it's something that just sort of fell down from the heaven that you had no control of, and it's just God gave you that. I remember being in church with my grandmother, who was a very powerful Pentecostal healer and spoke in tongues, and I was a as a Christian, I was blessed to be part of a more pagan holy roller black mixed congregation of Pentecostalists that my grandmother was a leader in, and so here she was, a Chinese woman who barely spoke English, um, and black pastors came from all over to hear her speak in tongues and to be healed by her. And even when she was 100 years old and on her deathbed, pastors were coming from all over just to have her speak in tongues and put her hands, lay hands, and so. And so, while I was raised a Christian, I was raised pretty much what most people would consider a pagan Christian, or at least a traditional African black religious um, uh, Christian. And so, as I've grown older, my ideas around what is the things that I learned as a child has changed. And so, um, as we go through this crisis that we're in right now, I think many of us are thinking about or wondering about like what's going on and how come bad things happen to good people and how come good things happen to bad people, and where is, I mean, this is like an existential crisis that we're in, and not just religiously but politically and also in terms of sustainability and climate and everything. And so I'm not just making a metaphor today about a particular religious thing or a particular political thing. So as you listen to my story here, I think that you're going to find your own um, things that you are thinking about, concerned about, have hopes for, wishes for, or believe you're going back to. And I think all of those things are going to be true. Part of storytelling is not just what I do, it's what you do with it. And so your interpretation of what I say is just as important as what my intent and what my agenda might be in saying it. And that's part of the whole idea of storytelling that's long gone. And so long gone is part of what I feel is how we have changed. And so typically, because we are, most of us by nature, recovering Christians or recovering Hellenists. And what I mean by that is that we are the byproducts of the Greco-Roman Empire. And so while we have words and things that we say, we really don't know what they are and what they mean. And so I'm going to give you an example. And this is the wormhole that I went down. And so most of us understand and know that there is a popular trope, a meme, a saying, a proverb that goes like this. Excuse me, I don't have the virus. Um, Wait, maybe I do. Um, there's a trope that goes this way, and most of us don't even know who wrote it. It's so far back in our history that we just hear it and we accept it, and we think we know what it means. All right. So um, I'm gonna go. I want to get the words exactly right here, because all right. If you don't know what I'm doing here, it looks like I'm in bed, but I'm surrounded by wires and lights and two laptops. And so this part that you see is sort of artifice, and everything else is like technology that you can't see. And it looks like I'm some sort of like tribal chieftain that somehow magically is talking to you, but I'm surrounded by technology. Um, so the saying is a saying that George Santayana is the one that actually said that. And what it is that those who do not understand history are doomed to repeat it. So we've all heard this. So we've heard it different ways. And so it has morphed, it has changed, it's been ascribed to many different people, everybody from Karl Marx to Franklin D. Roosevelt to Donald Trump. Actually, somebody has actually ascribed it to him. I found that in my wormhole. Um, and what that means to most of us is that history repeats itself, and that things that are happening now happened before. And so uh, while that's true, as I started to read what Santayana actually wrote at the turn of the century, he was actually talking about something a little bit more complex than that. And what he was talking about was change and revolution. And he was talking in the age of the Russian Revolution and the World Wars and all of the things that were going around at the turn of the century. And what he was saying is that when you throw out the old for the new and you don't retain the old, all kinds of horrible things happen. And every time horrible things happen, it is because the balance between the old and the new is not balanced. And so progress is always a thing between conservatism and liberalism, of status quo and progression. And so that's what he was talking about. And he was talking about it in a very philosophical sense, but he was saying that that happens in all senses. And so if you think about the 1900s, the early 1900s, he was talking about Darwinism at the time. He was talking about the Industrial Revolution. He was talking about the Marxist Revolution. He was talking about all of these revolutions that were going on and the inevitable thing that happens when change happens too much or too fast or too slow and not at all. And so that was the thing that I was looking at, and so I was thinking about this idea that we think we know what a trope, what a proverb, or what a saying means, and it actually means more if you look into the history of the thing. So that's an example of if you know something, you know, if you know the hidden history of something, you'll know more about it. And you'll also know that what you think you know isn't really true or is more amazing than what you think. All right. So I'll give you an example. Um, there's a trope that goes around that says Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court justice, is really stupid and never says anything, and they call him Silent George, actually, and there's another story behind that. They call him Thomas the Silent because he never says anything during hearings and during open sessions of the Supreme Court. Um, Anybody who's read the Supreme Court in the last 3 months has found that Clarence Thomas now almost always write some sort of a dissent, and they're long and scholarly dissents that are not not they don't fit with our picture of him. And so the hidden history of Clarence Thomas is that the guy who is the arch conservative on the court right now, and the guy who has passed laws that says English must be the language spoken in the United States, and who is only our second black justice. Um, One of the reasons that he doesn't usually speak is that English is his second language. And so Clarence Thomas grew up in the Geechee Gullah culture in Carolinas and Georgia, and it wasn't until his grandfather took him and his mom out of that culture and raised him as a Catholic that he actually spoke English as his first language. And so his ability to go to school and to college and to become a lawyer and a judge and all of those things were based upon the privilege that his grandfather bestowed on him. But his background is being poor, being the child of a culture that was a leftover culture in America of slavery that spoke two distinct slave languages. That is the language that he spoke growing up as a youngster before he learned English. And so, as an adult, he was very reticent to speak English, partially because he had an accent, and partially because his brain um, has had to translate the way historically the African language is into the way Western Greco Roman Christian Greek language is. And so that's why he is such a scholar of the English common law and Latin and Greek history. And so he's not dumb at all. He's just very conservative, trying so hard to be essentially European and white and to be accepted. And so if you know the history of a thing, you'll know the mystery of a thing. And so I'll get right into the story now. Hopefully we have everybody who's coming here, and so I'm going to talk today about grace. All right. And the title of my story is called The Four Friends. And like, if you're just coming here, you'll know that I just said that this story isn't told anywhere. You won't find it anywhere. I found it going down a rabbit hole, trying to understand the word grace. And so, as as people who are in Western culture, and I'm going to call us recovering Christians and recovering Hellenists because that's where our thought processes come from, that are different than the rest of the world. This is not indigenous thinking. Um, that ancient Greek, before Hellenism and before the Greek Empire, which was a huge empire that stretched from Spain, from the Iberian Peninsula, all the way over to the Anatolia region in Turkey and into the Russian steppes, and as far north as places like Finland. And so that was the Greek Empire before the Roman Empire. And so when we talk about the Keltoi, we're talking about the Greek Empire. And so that's now we think of Greece as this little island that conquered the world, and that's not exactly what Greeks were. And so before the Roman Empire was the Greek Empire. And so when they said grace, before they became a monotheistic religion, like Judaism became a monotheistic religion, and like the Roman Catholics became a monotheistic religion from Judaism, which also became a monotheistic religion from Egypt, which became a monotheistic religion. All of those monotheistic religions changed our language. So when you take the word grace and you look at its Greek roots, so you have gratias, and you find out that it is charistis, charistos, um, and it's where the word charity comes from, all right? So like karite is charity, but it's also where the word charisma comes from. Why? Because it is goddess culture. And so the three daughters of Zeus, the three graces, all right, the three Caristes, are the three women that represented grace. And so they were radiance and joy and blossoming. And so you see, we have gone from grace being a verb to a noun, something that we have inside of us that radiates out of us, to something that God drops in our lap. And so the Greek concept of grace before they became a monotheistic Zeus type religion was the goddess religions and the matriarchal religions saw grace as something that was innate and came out of you. It was God given, but it was God given at birth. It was just who you are. Our idea of grace now is Santa Claus. All right. It drops in through the chimney, it gives you a present, you get it, it's a thing. All right. We've gone from verbs to nouns. And so when you think about this idea of grace and lots of words, but we're going to use grace, is that when we say somebody has charisma, we're saying they have grace, but we're also saying that when somebody is filled with charity, they have grace and they have much to give. All right. So the idea of charisma and grace and charity are interlocked in ways we don't understand. And so I'm going to say remember, not understand. All right. We can talk about the word understand someday too. So you're probably wondering why I'm just sitting here in my pajamas laying in bed. And I wanted to show you something. Okay. So if you look up behind me and above me, this is my bed. All right. Um, and so what you're looking at here is is grace. In the Yoruba language, you're going to notice that I have digressions. In the Yoruba language, they don't have the word grace in the same way we have the word grace. All right. So there's no sense of grace. There's only the sense of sacrifice, that which is sacred and um, must be sacrificed for, must be. Grace is a relationship that you have with God that began before your birth. And so that's the way it was in ancient matriarchal cultures too. And so the metaphor that I'm sitting here is that if you look at this thing behind me, um, it it was most of you know that I'm a hoarder. That part of my obsession to go and find things and collect things, while my wife gives it away, is part of this culture that I come from, and why I feel like I don't necessarily fit in Western culture is because I have a different relationship to stuff. And so this is my stuff here. All right. So what this is an antique headboard. It's massive. It's king size. It weighs hundreds of pounds, and it is made of Iroko wood. In the middle here is a solid piece of Iroko wood. Iroko wood is the most sacred wood in the Yoruba culture, and it is the word that they would use for grace. Okay, so everything has a god or a deity or a loa or an orisha attached to it. Iroko is our relationship with grace. These trees are Iroko trees. And if you can see, people are making offerings to the tree. And everything they get in life, they give a portion of that up to the tree, and the tree evaporates its roots and goes up into the sky. And the metaphor is that grace is a circulation of energies, powers, what we call ashe, that come to us and we give back. Come to us, we give out. It's a radiance. It's a blossoming. It's very much like the Greek word of grace. So how did that change? Well, it didn't change a long time ago. It changed very recently. In the 1800s and the 1700s, during the Enlightenment, um, we find that the translations of the 16 and 17, 1800s we're taking Greek words and Latin words and Aramaic words in the Bible and changing it because we decided that, for instance, that grace is a thing that drops in your lap. So this headboard I found by the side of the road. It was free. And so it literally dropped in my lap. But when it dropped in my lap, my African traditional and indigenous way of thinking is I got this for a reason. I have to do something with it. And so I cleaned it, I polished it, I restored it. I made decisions about it. And if you were to look at my whole bed now, I built an entire bed around this headboard that matches. And so it has hidden compartments, it has carvings, it has matching furniture with it, it has all kinds of things. Because in my way of thinking, when I get something, I have to do something. What happened around the 18th, 19th, and the 20th century is that changed. The way of thinking happened was that in the same way that Calvinism said that everything was preordained, Lutheranism and Methodism and Protestantism changed into this idea that God was a monolithic being that stood above us and just handed us stuff. And those of us who were lucky enough to have grace were given things. The rest of us were witches, warlocks, heathens, pagans going to hell. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense that you might think, because the word paganus, pagan, the word heathen, etanokos, the word witch, wiche, are all words that were used to describe people who were not within the grace of God. Why? Because they were not part of the covenant. The relationship went from being in indigenous and natural organic relationship with the universe to one of a white-haired old man that gave us stuff in relationship for our fidelity and our loyalty oaths. That might sound familiar to some of you. Um, if you think about that, we went from God as the universe to God as Santa Claus. And so the mythology and the idea of around Westerners and Santa Claus fit and match what's going on. Where does that mythology come from? It comes from our Dutch, Swiss, German heritage. And so that's where the four friends come in. He was wondering when I'd get to this. Okay, so if you're going to watch this series, you're going to find that I go down digressions, rabbit holes, and because, well, that's the way I am. Um, but the four friends are four people that I didn't know were friends. But what I did know about them was that they are all four famous theologians, each one of them having a really important piece in 20th century Christianity and Protestantism, and that they are all German and that they are all Lutheran. And so when I started looking up the word grace, I found a really weird tidbit about a saying I thought I knew what it meant. And so many of you know this saying, okay? So I just told you a saying or a proverb or a prayer by Reinhold Niebuhr, um, by George Santayana. And now I'm going to tell you one by Reinhold Niebuhr, okay? You might not know who he is, but you do know this saying, especially those of you who have obsessive compulsive behaviors and addictions and hoarding behavior like I do. And it goes like this, all right? It's very often thought as a prayer, and it's called the Serenity Prayer. And the Serenity Prayer, for those of you who don't know it or don't know it by that name, goes like this: God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change and the courage to change the things that I can or must, and the wisdom to know the difference. Okay, so by raise of, if this were live, I could say by raise of hands, how many of you know that? Okay, so that's a very very famous tropes. Millions of people carry, literally millions of people carry that prayer in a coin in their pockets. It is the AA prayer. All right. Or if you are not a Christian, they call it the AA proverb, or, some people would call it a trope or a meme or whatever, whatever you're comfortable with. But it is a well known thing. And most people think it came about in the 50s. But the first actual recorded um, transcription of this prayer, and it was a prayer and a poem, was in 1932. And so a follower of Reinhold Niebuhr, who actually wrote it in her diary. So in 1932, she writes about this, and she writes about it this way. Okay, and in 1933, we'll see it repeated again in exactly the same way. And I'm just going to say the first part. God grant me the grace to accept with serenity the things that I cannot change. Now, Niebuhr, who was the director of the Union Theological Seminary in New York, was already a great and well-known theologian. So you might think he was just talking generically about grace and um, about the ideas that we associate with this prayer, because this is a conundrum that we have in our life, no matter who we are, no matter what we believe. Um, but what he was talking about was the theological argument he was having with his friends about what is grace. What is it that we accept, and what is it that we change? What is the difference between evolution and revolution? What is the difference between accepting the way things were and moving on to progress? Liberalism, status quo, conservative. You see, all of these things that affect us in our religions and our faith and our different practices also affect us in our politics, also affect us in our sexuality. I mean, if you think about just our ideas of gender fluidity and how they have changed and how people are pushing back and all kinds of different things. All right. So this tension, this push and pull was at the heart of Niebuhr's philosophical exchange with his friends. All right. So, who are his friends? Well, his friends are scattered all over the world by the time he writes this, and he is apoplectic. He's not just writing about this philosophically, he's writing this because his friend Martin is in Germany right now. And Martin is a Lutheran pastor who is a vehement supporter of the Nazi Party and a follower of Adolf Hitler. And so this is his friend. And his other friend is in England because he got kicked out of Germany because his name is Dietrich. So Dietrich is over in England and he's preaching against the Nazi Party. And his friend Paul, who was in Germany, got kicked out and had to run out of Germany because the Nazis were after him. And so he gives Paul a job at Union Theological Seminary, and Paul starts to talk about what's going on in Germany. And Reinhold had no idea how horrible it was. And he had no idea how broken up his Lutheran church was, and how all of the pastors had either escaped and scattered or were being sucked into this whole idea that there was one German Lutheran church that has one leader, and that one leader was going to be the leader of the Nazi Party. Um, Let me back up a second, because if you don't understand 1932, you will be doomed to repeat it. In the 1900s, a couple of things happened. And so in 1980, we had the First World War, and we went to war with what we now call Germany. It really wasn't German at the time. It was a whole collection of states that are variously called the Prussian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Reich. And what happened was that at the same time, there was this horrible, horrible World War. Okay, so we're talking about 1916 to 1920 now. That there was also a horrible, horrible pandemic called the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu didn't come from Spain. It was just that Spain was the only one talking about it and doing something about it. The Spanish flu probably came from China and the United States, and it infected the whole world. And in the United States, the president in the United States had this massive pandemic going on, and literally hundreds of thousands of people were dying for years. And he said nothing. We had no federal national pandemic response. Okay, this is not a political statement that I'm making. Yes, it is. But in Germany, the same thing was happening. They were also in total denial of this whole thing. So while this horrible war was going on, soldiers were in contact with each other and they were dying. And people that they came in contact with all throughout Europe and Russia and Asia were dying by the millions, literally, in a pandemic that was way beyond what we're experiencing right now. We're just at the beginning of our pandemic. But when the World War One ended, Germany was decimated not just by the war, but by the pandemic itself. And the pandemic that that decimated Germany also decimated the rest of the world. But the political disarray in which the states that became Germany, what was left of the empire, created so much dissension and so much chaos and so much dissolution that it disemboweled the entire German, we're going to call it the Gestalt, because there wasn't a German country at that time. What there was a European Union of Germanic states. So Prussia, Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, all of these states used to be all combined together, including Hungary and Poland and other things that they just all sucked in together. Now, so what happens is that when the war is over, the pandemic goes into a second phase. The armistice happens. Everybody goes back out into the streets, starts celebrating, goes back to school, goes back to work, goes back to their jobs, goes back from the army, goes back from their hospital beds, and a worse pandemic happens. The second phase of the pandemic is literally 5 times worse than what happened during World War One. And so there is this second phase in 1918 that happens when everybody goes back to normal. So in a few months, when we go back to school, we're going to go back to normal. All right. If you don't know history, you are doomed to repeat it. What happened in Germany, though, for my four friends, I always will come back to the point eventually. Um, but what happened to our four friends is that when they were younger, the main parties that made up Germany, the monarchist parties and the democratic parties and the socialist parties, and then the budding communist parties, the revolutionary parties that George Santayana warned us about, all dissolved because they were blamed for the war, they were blamed for the depression, and they were blamed for the plague. They called it the plague. And if you were around in the 1900s, you didn't think of plagues as viruses or bacterias. You thought of it as periods of time when there were great depressions, when there were great wars, when there was great disease, when there was great death. So the bubonic plague was a depression. It was a religious upheaval. It was a political upheaval. It was chaos, and it was death, and it was a disease, and it was caused by God's displeasure with us. In 1920, as a response to this horrible plague, and we'll call it the series of plagues, but really it was like one huge, huge, bad thing that was happening in Germany at the time that some of us can relate to right now, is that two parties came into being. One was an answer to the monarchist, communist, socialist parties, and that was the Independent Party. Is that the remnants of the conservative parties pulled themselves together and created an independent party that was independent of blame to the plague and blame to the monarchy and blame to the pandemic and blame to the literal hundreds and hundreds of thousands of military deaths and the millions of worldwide deaths that they were being blamed for. And that was the Independent Party. And what they did was they got a war hero named von Hindenburg, that the blimp is named after. And von Hindenburg became the sort of savior president of Germany after the 1920s for 8 years. He was the Obama of his time. He was the renaissance of all the things that was going to bring back all the greatness of what Germany used to be before they tried to take over the world, before the assassinations, before the upheavals of their civil rights movement. He was the promise of that. And he literally, at the time, was the hope. I mean, that's what they called him, the hope of Germany. At the same time, there was another guy, and he created and was part of the creation of the other answer to the party. His party blamed all of these other nations. They blamed the Jews, they blamed the Polish, they blamed the Hungarians, they blamed all of these people that they took over that came into Germany and or refused to leave their own country or refused to assimilate. Um, and they became a nationalist party. They were going to make Germany great again, literally. And I don't say that, politically. Yes, I do. Um, I say that because that is the words that they actually used. They called themselves socialists, but they were not really interested in socialism. They had nothing to do with socialism. In fact, they were the worst form of oligarchy and capitalism, fascism. All right. But the word fascism was not in fashion at the time. And so they called themselves socialists, but their aim was to only share with themselves being those people that belong to their nation. Now, there were no nation states at the time. There weren't borders in countries as we think. There was only a union that had people who belonged and people who didn't belong, people who were manifestly destined to belong to a eugenic master race, an idea that they got from America, not from Germany. And those people were called Nazis. Now, the star of the Nazi party was a man named Adolf Hitler. And so that's the backstory of this backstory to my backstory. In 1932, von Hindenburg steps down as president after 8 years, and chaos ensues. And what happens is that the democratically elected head of the Nazi party forms a coalition and becomes the de facto, like the prime minister. So in the same way that England and Israel have parliamentary coalitions to figure out who's the head of the parliament, There's a president and a prime minister. They do the same thing and they name Hitler as the chancellor. Essentially, as chancellor, it's obvious that he is going to dismantle this democracy, that he's going to give monarchy no choice and no chance of ever coming back again, that he is going to destroy all of the things he has railed against, and that he is going to oppress the Prussian people, the Polish people, the Jewish people, and all of those people in the countries that they still have conquered. So let's get back to our four friends. These four pastors now are scattered all over the world by the 1930s because of this unrest and because of some of their inability to join the Nazi Lutheran Church, the German Unified Church, um, the one true church. They all take sides. And this causes great dissension amongst the friendship. And the tension in this friendship manifests itself in letters. And they start writing letters to each other. And it is within all of this communication and letters that we know about what happened to the word grace in 1932 and why Reinhold Niebuhr wrote this poem. So the poem that you know is just the preamble to a very long poem where he talks about grace and he talks about all of the things that he's trying to figure out about what happened. That he thought God would take care of everything. That if you are good, that there was a meritocracy that said that all of the right things you do is not good enough. It's the right things you have because God favors you. God favors your race. God favors your color. God favors your cause. God favors your thoughts. God favors your religion. And all of a sudden, everything that you believe to be true is changed. God is not supporting your religion. God is destroying your religion. If you believe in grace, if you accept that what's supposed to happen just happens. And so, this sort of Christian theology that happened since the Enlightenment of 100 years of shit happens and it's God's will, all of a sudden you're thinking, did God will this? Did God will Nazis? Did God will pandemics? Did God will the Great Depression? Because if you remember in 1932, we're in the Great Depression now. And there's a new pandemic going on because tuberculosis is happening again, and the plague is happening again, and smallpox is happening again. So theologians are going, this is not what Luther told us. This is not what the Pope told us. And this is what Reinhold is wrestling with when he writes this poem. Why? Because he's writing letters to his friend Reinhold in England. And Reinhold is saying to him, you can't let this happen. You are the head of the Lutheran Church theologically in the United States. You are the most powerful theologian in the world right now, and you just took in Paul Tillich, the most powerful German the Lutheran theologian, to teach at your college, and you guys are teaching the theology of Lutheranism now is here. Too bad about Germany. We are men of God and have no politics. Dietrich in London is saying to Reinhold, no, you must go back. You must fight this power. You must go and talk to our friend Martin and tell him he's wrong, that he can't join the Nazi Party, that he can't bring Lutheranism as one of the last remaining Lutheran theologians into the national church. He cannot be a part of making the Reich great again. This is what the poem is about. These are the things he is saying, I can't change it. Or can I change it? How do I get the wisdom to change the things I can and do nothing about the things I can't? With serenity. This is the serenity prayer. He's literally praying to God to be serene when bad shit is going on. He's saying, God, grant me the grace to accept with serenity the rise of Nazism and the takeover of my church in 1932. Why? Because famous theologians that he is also friends with, because I could call this story the 50 Friends, because I could talk about 50 theologians in Germany that were important in the Reformation of Lutheranism, as well as the Catholic Church, as well as the Jewish faith, as well as the Hungarian Church, as well as the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox Church, that are all being forced to make this decision to join the Nazi Church. And he's praying to God for serenity to accept the fact that he can't change anything. And he and Paul Tillich, the most famous and probably the most important Christian Protestant theologian of the 20th century, are going to stay in the United States and do nothing. What does Dietrich do? Dietrich goes back to Germany to confront Hitler and gets put into a concentration camp. Martin is so distraught and horrified by the fact that his correspondence of defending Hitler was so wrong that he goes to talk to Hitler, who he knows, who he considers to be an ally and friend of his church. Um, he's unsuccessful. Dietrich dies in a concentration camp over 10 years later. In 1932, we are looking at the rise of a democratically elected leader who makes himself chancellor and president for life. And with it, he takes the government, and with it, he takes the idea that he will close the borders and suppress and murder all of the people that he blames for his Great Depression, that he blames for chaos and unrest, that he blames for the failures of his 10 years of elected office and his party's supremacy and overtaking of the independent and the getting rid of the great hope that ruled for 8 years and almost brought Germany back to a sense of order until he destroyed it democratically. If we do not understand or accept that the things that we experience today in our lives, personally, politically, religiously, universally, whatever, are parts of cycles and things and parts of our human nature, we're not going to understand what to choose and what to do and what to accept and how to accept it. Because we're talking about grace now, remember that. Our indigenous foremothers believed that grace was a quality that we had. And so when we say that grace is something that you are given, it means that it's a birthright. It comes out of you, but it is not the daughters of Zeus. So the three Graces are the daughters of Zeus. But before they were the daughters of Zeus, they were the goddesses that existed for the Keltoi people, that existed for the Celts, that existed long before Zeus was made the supreme ruler of all of the Greek pantheons of gods and the goddesses that were done away with. Because grace became an idea in our heads. Sophistry, Sophia, knowledge became a thought within our head when she was a goddess. Aisata, who was the love of God, became an idea in our head. And they were all things that God bestows upon us. And we just sit here and grab and take everything because we are full of grace. That means we have privilege. That means God has chosen us. That's not what it used to mean. Get back to the four friends. So there used to be, see, I went on a digression here. There used to be a man named Paul Harvey when I was little. So if you're old enough, you remember A, the radio, and B, a man named Paul Harvey who used to tell stories shorter than this, called The Rest of the Story. And the rest of the story, good Jack, the rest of the story is what's important. So there's a backstory you don't know about, and there's a rest of the story you don't know about. So you all know about the Serenity Prayer, but do you know the rest of the story? Martin is Martin Niemöller. Raise your hand if you know who Martin Niemöller is. Okay, I'm pretending like I can actually see you. I'm psychic. All right, I see some of you do know who he is, or I sense that. Martin Niemöller also wrote a prayer. He also wrote a proverb, a poem, a thing that many of us carry around, and a thing that many of us think about now more than we ever have, not just as a an aphorism or a euphemism or a prayer, but something that actually has meaning to us now in ways we never imagined that it would. Martin Niemöller is Pastor Martin Niemöller, who you may know because he wrote a prayer, a poem that has been repeated and ascribed, like these other poems and prayers, to many, many people. But he was a German Lutheran pastor. He was a German Lutheran pastor who served in World War I, and he was a Navy man. And he was a patriot. And he believed in National Socialism. And he wrote these words. When they came after the trade unionists, I said nothing because I was not a trade unionist. When they came after the socialists, I said nothing because I was not a socialist. When they came after the communists, I said nothing. And I did nothing because I was not a communist. You don't ever see this one. When they came after the Schwarzers, when they came after the black people, I said nothing. I did nothing because I was not a Schwarzer. When they came after the Gypsies, when they came after the Romani, I said nothing and I did nothing. There are versions of this prayer where he lists 10, 15 groups of people that the Nazis, came after, and he said nothing, and he did nothing. And he ends his poem by saying, and when they finally came after me, there was nobody to save me. He doesn't just mean this in the sense of Hitler has killed everybody or taken everybody. He means this in the sense of he abandoned his friend Dietrich. He abandoned his friend Jarl. He abandoned his friend Karl. He abandoned the Jewish, the Polish, the Hungarian priests and ministers and reverends that he knew that were now in prison for not obeying Hitler and joining the one national party and the one national church. This was not a theoretical or theosophical idea he was espousing. He was saying literally he was the last man standing because he said nothing against Hitler until he did, and then he became the enemy. And in 1932, in a state, because they didn't have countries, in a state called Prussia, there was so much chaos and unrest because the army refused to go in Prussia and put down the Prussian people and the Polish Jews that the governor of Russia, who was put into place by the chancellor of New Germany, created the state police in order to crush the rebellion against the Nazis in Prussia. And this was such a great idea that Hitler took this state police, the Geheime Staatspolizei, and created the Gestapo to create state polices on a federal level to send federal marshals into the state, disobeying the prime directive of all civilized countries to never send your army against your own people. He created a private federal army called the Secret State Police, the Gestapo, to round up all ministers, all Catholic priests, all Jewish rabbis, all pagans, all all um, heathen practitioners, of which there were many at the time, and all esotericists, and put them in concentration camps. Martin Niemöller and his friend Dietrich started the confession movement, and that was the resistance to the Nazi Party. The Lutheran Church resisted the Nazis for the next 10 years in the Church of the Confession. And what did they confess? They confessed that they were wrong. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who sits alongside these four friends as the four most famous theologians of Protestantism, not just Lutheranism, but Protestantism, wrote in the 1920s that grace is not a state of being, that grace is not a gift from God, that grace is an action, grace is a verb, that grace that is given is cheap grace, that grace that is hoarded is not grace at all. It is vanity, it is narcissism. It is the hoarding of God's blessings and the inability to understand the relationship between the universe, yourself, and your fellow man. The Serenity Prayer suggests that we need to just accept things with serenity. God, give me the grace to accept with serenity. But instead, when you look at Theology of Grace of Paul Tillich, by far the most famous of these four friends, he is saying, stay the course, be conservative, accept God's grace, accept God's will, accept God's. But if you are in the middle of it, like Dietrich found himself when he went back to challenge Hitler and to stand with the people who believe that Jewish lives matter, that Black lives matter, that Prussian lives matter, that Romani lives matter, that gay lives matter. When he joined and was put in concentration camp and died there, that he created the theology of change, and that grace, that charistes, that charisma is the ability of leaders who have this gift, who have charistes, practice charity, that your inability to take what you may believe God has given you and not do shit with it is a sin. And that you have the duty to put your life on the line because you were given a destiny. You were given grace. You were given charistes. You were given charity because you had much to give and you were given charisma. Charisma is not just being full of joy and full of radiance and full of power and full of passion and full of sexiness, all of which I have. It is, what do you do with that? Because truly, the things that make you joyful, the things that make you graceful, the things of, stop laughing, Christy, the things that make you what you are what you do, not what you have, not what you get, but what you do. And so I want you to think of these four friends, but I also want you to think about the things that you accept. Do you accept that you know what grace means? Do you accept that you know what charity means? Do you accept that you know that the things that have been hidden by your own history, by your own church, by your own Western civilization, by your own ancestors, do you accept those things? And by accepting those things, do you not act? I want to leave you with a challenge. I'm going to hang out after this and we can talk about things, but all of these things that we are talking about right now is in our face again. I want you to think about George Santayana. I want you to think about Reinhold Niebuhr. I want you to think about Pastor Niemöller and what he said. And while it used to be like Godwin's law, just a euphemism, just a metaphor that we use, we are now literally in the place where, not just here, but worldwide, we are asking ourselves, what can we accept and what can't we accept? I hope you aren't asking for serenity. I hope you are asking for change. But more than just praying in the way that our Greek and Jewish and Egyptian and monotheistic ancestors told us to pray. There was a time when prayers and poetry and proverbs were the same thing, when they were not begging, when we did not ask for God's grace, when we did not ask for God to just give us shit, when we did not ask for God's favor. There was a time when all of these religions that became patriarchal and monotheistic used to be different. When a prayer and a poem was the same thing, read the Psalms. Read Solomon. read all of the things, read the epic poetry, read the Veda, read the Greek epic poets, read the Mahabharata, read all of the epic poetry that exists before monotheism. They talk about people who do shit. They talk about the hero's journey. They talk about people who are given the gift of greatness and go out and do stuff. They go out and save people. They go out and find things, not to hoard them, not to enslave people, not to become rich or powerful or famous, but because grace is that to whom much is given, much is expected. That's another thing you want to look at and find the hidden history of that phrase. All of these things are related. And so I hope you've given you a couple of things to chew on, and I hope you come back in a couple of weeks and tell your friends, we're going to talk like this for as long as it takes. I'm going to stay in this bed until, no, I promise I'll put pants on next time and do something standing up. But I want you to come back and I want you to bring people, I want you to follow us here, um, because I want to be able to talk like this and tell stories like this. And I promise you, I will tell true stories and what truth is to me as much as I can. And so I hope you have a great week or a great 2 weeks. I hope you come back and I'll hang out here. And yes, Alicia, I have no pants on you and you can't tell me I'm lying. Um, and so all of these things, this is a robe. Um, all of these things that we're going to talk about are going to be like this. All right. I believe in hidden histories. I believe in the mysteries that are found within the things we think we know. And I believe that our ability to change our mind is based upon our ability to change our behaviors, not the information that we get, not the grace we get from God or whatever it is you believe in, but in what we do. And I hope to hear your stories too. So thank you, Namaste. I hope to hear from all of you, and I hope you come back, bring back more people, and have coffee and brunch with me every other Sunday, and follow us on Crowdcast because Kate will be doing fun things too. She's talking about divination. We're going to start something called My Dinner With, and we're just going to have dinner with people online who are really, really interesting. And so I already have a half a dozen commitments from people. And if you're interested in sharing a meal with me, um, we talk about food. We talk about whatever we want to talk about. And we talk about the interrelationship between all things and what we and these people have in common and what we talk about. And so, and if you want to do that, I want you to watch a movie called My Dinner with Andre. All right. It's probably free on YouTube now. But My Dinner with Andre is the inspiration for My Dinner With. And so Kate and I will be having dinner with people and just talking. All right. A different kind of storytelling, but we really think that what's going on right now is an opportunity for us to reach out and tell stories and to give back and to give away um, in huge, huge ways. It's a sort of my thankfulness for receiving this giant headboard behind me, so I didn't have to buy a green screen. Okay, so thank you all, and I'll hang out here and read the chats if you want to talk. In the future, I'll be opening the green room before. And so you can all gather and chat before we tell a story, as well as chat afterwards as I learn about this and figure out how to do stuff. All right. Blessings to you. And thank you for joining us. And we'll see you soon. All right. I love you all. So feel free to ask a question. I'm not going to type because I'm a terrible typist, which is a horrible, horrible confession to make if you're a writer. But I write 1,000-page books with two fingers. Um, and so that's my confession for today. All right. Thanks, Terp. Thanks, Alicia. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Jack. Thank you all for coming. And there's so much more that we can do on this Zoom platform and this Crowdcast platform that if any of you want to talk about how to use these technologies in different and new ways, I'm very, very inspired by how people are using it. On Wednesday, I'm doing a Zoom cast with a church that's doing a Harry Potter camp on Minecraft, and I'm so, so inspired by them that we're doing the Itsy Bitsy Spider that you might have seen us do for children, if you've seen us before teaching children, telling stories. But what they're doing is so inspiring to me that I'm going to steal that idea. It's so brilliant to talk to children in Minecraft and using Zoom in a totally different way than schools are using it. So incredible and inspiring, and stuff is going on all over the world, and we're being taught by our kids how to communicate, because I guarantee you that my kids were on Zoom and doing stuff long before we were. They know how to like paint pictures on Zoom and how to write on the screen. And so, yeah, the art of digging tunnels. And so it's kind of like Hogan's Heroes, but on a massive, massive scale. So this church has recreated Hogwarts Castle in Minecraft, and they teach their camp in a virtual Minecraft thing. I believe that one of the people that signed up for this is one of the people that do that. So I hope that she sees this and inspires us, and will do a crowdcast and tells what we'll do. Oh, Kelly, I saw what you wrote. I think that there are many things that we need to learn, and we're thinking about doing a crowdcast on how to make your sound work, and which browsers work better than other browsers, and which companies try to disarm your apps and break your sound, or why you have those weird echo things happening, and why Zoom is a terrible platform for sound. Um, and why we can't have sing-alongs together. Um, so I hope you get that worked out. But but I hope you can still hear me. And thanks for coming. Um, great. Uh, yeah, that's how I spell back too. And so yeah, Jack. I give me a DM on Messenger, and we can talk, because we should have dinner together, but also I think that there are ways that you can collaborate in Crowdcast that you can't in Zoom. And so this weekend, if you guys have the opportunity, HexFest is happening virtually while we speak. And there are archived many, many things on Crowdcast, and it's a very amazing platform that we're on right now, that gives you a web page that does all kinds of different things, but also gives you the technology to do things that are. I'm hoping that you're seeing me much clearer than you do on Zoom, that you're hearing me much clearer, but also the ability to record and to archive and to save these, or to monetize what you do. You can do this for money. Hexfest is charging money on this platform, and doing their entire convention, the largest Hex convention in the country, is being done right now on this platform, on Crowdcast. Yes, thanks, Jeff. I can tell that you see me clearly, and I know that you're not joking. So so you can see the sound of my voice. So let's talk more. And also, I think that this is a platform where people can actually help each other, because I get technological advice from people using this, And so what I do is I like invite them on, and they actually point to the screen and say stuff and tell me where things are and teach me tricks. And um, we're in such a pioneer phase and stage, and I sympathize with anybody who is trying to do technology right now, because um, it's amazing what we don't know. Uh, and that's what we're going to look at in the future. And so I hope that I hope that all of the platforms that we use become much more robust, and because I don't believe that we're going back to how we used to do things in the past. And I believe that the ability for us to um, reach people without having brick and mortar, without having conventions, without having churches, without having all of the things that may come back but will never come back the same, that we have the ability to do that. So does anybody have any questions before I just prattle on and on? um, I want to thank Kate for ironing my shirt that she bought for me, and that she's upgrading my image while we're here in quarantine, COVID quarantine. um, and also say that while I'm sitting here just chatting with you and drinking coffee, um, Kate is remodeling our whole house. Our whole house is now a studio. Um, we will have a salon. We'll have a kitchen that has camera capability. We have dining rooms. We have every room has altars. All the house, which is a 1910 stucco Spanish old house we bought for nothing. That um, that we're remodeling everything. And so I used to be a cabinet maker, and so we're putting in all built-ins. We're putting in uh, the ability to plug in any room and broadcast from there. And we're also creating sound studios, and also places, backgrounds where we can do stuff. All the stuff we do at conventions, we can do at home. And someday I hope to be able to do a crowdcast from my hot tub. Um, and I will wear pants, I promise, if we do that. Uh, and that's coming. But we have a koi pond in the back now, that is like a little stage. We have a fire ring. Hope to have my pizza oven soon. Like I said, I'm a hoarder. All of this stuff that we have is basically stuff we have gotten for almost nothing, and is free. And so we'll do a story time. We'll do a tour of the house one of these days. But all right. So I know that sometimes listening to me is like listening to a fire hose, and that you have to go rest now, and have a sedative or a cup of coffee or something. So um, if you want to talk to me, you're welcome always to private message me. I'm on Facebook under Ted Zhao, Instagram Ted and Kate. And please follow us if you do that sort of thing. And this particular thing here has a feature where if you follow us here, you get notifications of all of the different things we're going to do. All right. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Terp. Thanks, everybody. Um, and all of you who have left already, come back again soon. And I'm going to end the broadcast right now. All right. Uh, Namaste. I love you all.